Have you ever wanted to make Limbus Company more difficult? I think it's safe to say that, aside from a few notable exceptions, this game is pretty easy. A lot of people play levels with only one sinner in order to make the game more challenging, but solo runs have never really appealed to me personally, as it kinda takes the fun out of the game, the team building part. I think it's safe to say also that solo runs are a bit oversaturated at the moment. I wanted to make a way that this game could be more difficult without removing the team building aspect, so I started jotting down ideas. Using only base sinners and ego does a decent job at making the game slightly more difficult, but even they can brute force their way through almost every piece of content this game has to offer. Not allowing myself to use ego? Honestly, that doesn't make any part of the game more difficult, as most skill 3s nowadays are pretty strong, all things considered. What if I limited myself to only using one skill affinity? So if we're starting a challenge run, we need to establish our rules. This is going to be done in Mirror Dungeon 3 Normal, since I'm not sure I want to bash my head into a wall trying to do this in Mirror Dungeon 3 Hard. The most obvious rule is that I'm only allowed to use one type of skill, but let's take it a bit further. For the purpose of this run, I will only be allowed to generate one affinity or sin resources. Technically, you are allowed to spend other resources through corrosion, but your other resource counts aren't allowed to increase at any point. But now there's an issue in that most IDs at Uptie 3 have defense skills that don't generate any sin affinity. So let's add to these rules a little bit. All of my IDs have to be at Uptie 4 to prevent me from bringing an ID that would perfectly shore up my weaknesses in a run. This also stops me from just resetting until I have an optimal skill setup. Now that we have the most important rule out of the way, it was time to pick a sin affinity. Originally, I had wanted to pick either Envy or Lust, since those are the only affinities that can fuel an ego perfectly, being Hexnail or Lifetime Stew respectively. But I also wanted to use at least 6 IDs, and Lust defense skills are only found on 5 sinners, and while Envy does have 6 sinners, the IDs it provides are almost all counter-based when it comes to their defense skills, and I wasn't sure if I could make it through exclusively based on counters. After looking through all of the IDs and seeing what defense skill affinities I had available, I eventually settled on Gloom for my party. So now we have our base set of rules, but what if we took this a bit further again? Since this is a Mirror Dungeon run, there are a lot of ego gifts that could trivialize our weaknesses if we're able to get them. So why don't we limit our gift selection to ego gifts in the Gloom category as well? This makes it so we can't just rely on ego gifts, while still giving us a good selection of gifts to choose from. While I would love to say that Blue Zippo Lighter would solve our issues, it unfortunately generates resources that aren't Gloom, so taking it would break the rules. There's also a good deal of gifts here that just do nothing thanks to our selection of potential IDs. So here's the list of gifts that are both available and do something for us. While not a huge amount of options, there are some real winners here, like Grey Coat and Phantom Pain. Is there anything else to add? How about no healing at rest stops and shops? I'll be honest, this rule was one I added arbitrarily at a certain point in the run, so you can definitely skip this rule if you want. Who knows, maybe this rule actually makes some of the later fights a lot more difficult because we're really low on HP or something. Oh, and I'm not gonna reset fights just because of a death either, except for the last boss, because there's nothing after that fight anyways. Now that we have all of our rules set up, let's go about picking what IDs I'll be using in this team. Firstly, though, let's go over the IDs I could have brought but decided not to. W Corp Yi Sang's third skill is really powerful and he has a Gloom Evade, but unfortunately he can't build his own charge to fuel his skill, and I just kinda thought that he wouldn't be as useful. Zwei Sinclair is an ID I seriously considered since he has really nice bulk and he only gets more bulky if he loses a clash with his skill 1. He also gives people defense power-up using his passive, which helps evades roll higher. It would have been pretty helpful later in the run, honestly. Liu Honglu didn't really provide anything to the team, and his defense skill wasn't very good, so he was an easy ID to drop. LCB Sinner Gregor is like Honglu, he just didn't bring much to the team, aside from being able to provide passive healing, which would have helped out a bit. N-Corp Heathcliff, I forgot about. Though to be honest, even if plus coin drop would have been insanely helpful, he just has no survivability thanks to having a weakness to blunt damage. Muller Sinclair is the only ID I could have brought to activate Rose Spanner Merceau's support passive. but his skill 1 is just awful, and I also forgot about him. Sloshing Ishmael is yet another ID that is bulky and would abuse aggro to support the team, but unfortunately has some very steep competition. You could also technically bring Regret Faust since she has a Gloom counter, but I'm not doing that. Now onto the IDs that I actually brought. Reindeer Ishmael seemed like a pretty easy inclusion right from the start. Not only does she have the best skill 1 in the entire game, and it just happens to be Gloom, but since I'm activating Gloom Absolute Resonance every turn, she'll be guaranteed to have +2 final power at all times thanks to her passive. Her being a charge ID that can gain charge very quickly also lends to activating Curriculum Vitae, which will give even more of a power boost for her. The 4-14 evade is also not bad at all, plus it has a useful effect tied to it. The second reason I didn't bring W Corp Yisang is actually because I was hoping to take advantage of base Yisang's support passive to counteract the potential SP loss from Ishmael's passive. For future reference, it is the only SP loss in the game that doesn't trigger base Yisang's support passive, so that ended up not being as useful as I'd hoped. The Etchi Rhodia was also a very easy inclusion. Even though her skill 1 starts off pretty weak, I'm pretty much guaranteed to discard a skill 2 or 3 by using her block, meaning she hits pretty hard regardless. On top of that, her passive allows her damage to hit very high numbers even with only a skill 1, and even removes a status condition sometimes. She also gains so much shield from discarding her unusable skills that she can tank pretty much anything that isn't a pierce attack, making her one of the only IDs in the game with an actual good block. And on top of that, it gives aggro, which is very helpful in a challenge like this that doesn't allow healing. W Corp Don Quixote is stuck with a skill 2, but it's one of the most reliable skill 2s in the entire game and activates Curriculum Vitae off of just a single use. It inflicts Fragile as well, which helps with the inconsistent damage output of the team by a lot. Even though her evade isn't super impressive, it's also just reliable enough to survive most enemy attacks. Her passive ended up being pretty useless since she doesn't really need 2 additional charge, but in theory it's a helpful piece of her kit here. Zweifaust is probably the strangest choice in this team considering her skill 2 isn't super impressive even with 3 coins. In practice, she gains aggro using her guard skill and then eats damage that would otherwise be directed into a weaker team member. The big reason I ended up including her was that she's the only character who had a slash skill I could utilize, and I wasn't sure how often that would come up in this run. Pirate Gregor was included because his skill 3 is incredibly good for damage, even though I could never activate his passive. Having a high rolling skill on a character with a good evade was a very important factor into most of the IDs I ended up taking, and Pirate Greg fit the bill perfectly, though in hindsight I think I would have preferred the passive healing from base Gregor. The other thing pushing him onto the team was his usefulness with Pendant of Nostalgia, since he is a poise ID. Lastly, Mariachi Sinclair was an easy include due to his powerful evade, as well as a skill 3 that rolls higher than any other skill in the party, except a boosted Ishmael skill 1. It turns out, this usually garbage ID becomes quite a bit stronger when the 5 skill slots he has that suck aren't usable anyways. In addition, every action he makes reduces his own stagger threshold, making him near impossible to stagger in battle. His only real downside is his abysmal 2-3 speed stat, but I could overlook that as a negative in this, for instance. So now that we have the team together, let's jump into the Mirror Dungeon and see how hard this run is actually going to be. The first thing we have to do is pick our starting ego gift. I didn't want to spend time resetting for Greycoat, so I had to settle with one of the 3 starter gifts that would have an effect. Pendant of Nostalgia would help to increase damage by a bit, but it's pretty common, so I ended up passing it up. Skeletal Crumbs increases damage as well as increasing defense. Ishmael is the one who enables us to work. Ultimately though, I figured that having Curriculum Vitae would be the best choice since I had 2 IDs that easily reach the activation conditions and gain the +1 power from it. Normal fights on the first floor don't have too much different from usual except that they take a little longer due to the amount of defense skills I'm required to use. So instead, let's talk about the big problem with this team. Sanity. The first issue is that Mariachi Sinclair is so slow that he never gets to clash, and so his SP is basically locked at 0. This isn't really a problem on floor 1 thanks to his massive defense level, but if he doesn't get SP soon, he's gonna struggle. Ishmael has a much more pressing problem. If she's ever unable to use her skill 1 on a turn, she is guaranteed to lose 15 SP at the end of the turn. I had tried to compensate for this by using Yisang's support passive, but it turns out that that doesn't work on SP loss from Ishmael's passive. This means that the longer a fight lasts, the more likely Ishmael is going to be at lower sanity, and as my main attacker, that is not a good thing. I managed to get Illusory Hunt from the first floor shop. While not super useful immediately, it's going to help with damage output a lot against bosses in the Mirror Dungeon. Guido isn't the worst first boss that could have shown up in this run, given that all of N-Corp is weak to blunt damage, but his ability to increase the sanity of his minions does a good job at putting me on a bit of a timer. Since not every member of my team was at 45 SP, and Sinclair was still at 0 by this point, my evades weren't going to be reliable for the entire fight. This was shown pretty quickly as Sinclair failed an evade and was instantly staggered because Guido has an attack that does that. This was the first fight where I took damage, though it wasn't too much, thankfully. I took the challenge fight at the start of Floor 2 in hopes of a Gloom Gift showing up, though it didn't give me anything I could use. Challenge fights aren't that much different from normal fights until the later floors, specifically Floor 4, so it's generally safe to do them, even in Mirror Dungeon Hard, for a free gift on earlier floors. It was at the second floor rest stop where I arbitrarily decided that I would not allow myself to heal at rest stops and shops. The challenge to this point had been pretty easy, with only Sinclair taking any serious damage. In retrospect, not allowing myself to heal made the last floor of this dungeon far more difficult than it would have been otherwise. This meant that my team could only heal using Painkiller and Grey Coat, which I was determined to find as a result. This was also where I upgraded Curriculum Vitae to level 3 in order to gain more haste on Ishmael and Don. By the second floor boss, Gregor and Don had both been hit a single time due to an unlucky evade. My second floor boss was the Crawling Inquisitors, which provided an interesting challenge due to my team using mostly multi-coin skills. Since these guys enrage after being hit 4 times, I had to try and space out my damage as much as I could to prevent multiple enemies from being enraged at once. This team was incapable of killing a single Inquisitor in one turn, so no matter what, I was dealing with their enraged state. This was the first fight where I chose to forego damage in some cases in order to evade, since that would allow me to stall sometimes. That said, Sinclair was too slow to redirect any attacks, but I managed to get through the fight without taking any damage, until the last turn, where the main Inquisitor outrolled one of my evades with Furious Chase and hit Gregor for about 20 damage total. Faust was my best damage dealer in this fight, thanks to the enemies being weak to slash. The biggest danger to my HP were enemies with counter skills. This is shown in the very next fight, where an N-Corp Inquisitor hits Gregor for almost twice as much damage as he took in the previous fight due to counters. This was the last challenge fight I took as a result of that. I also got Broken Revolver as a reward, though it is useless since we can't inflict any rupture. This was the floor where our HP started to really get into the dangerous levels. Gregor got hit once again in the next fight, putting his HP in the 60s, making him the first team member to drop below half health. It sucks a little more too, since the next shop gave him a second copy of his third skill, helping his damage output by doubling his possible attacks. I also managed to grab Pendant of Nostalgia, helping Greg out even more. Normal fights have been mostly uneventful aside from the occasional tap from an enemy after an unlucky evade. These K-Corp Excision guys jump-scared me in a normal fight, but they didn't end up causing any issues at all. This was the first floor where I ended up doing a focus encounter, which takes quite a bit more planning to get through. I actually do 2 of them, again in hopes that I get a Gloom Gift. These can be a little bit frustrating since Ishmael can never have any additional slots, meaning she's more likely to lose SP when fighting against the Pekatula. While these 2 fights weren't super threatening, they did reveal the additional dangers of doing focus encounters in general, and Greg got staggered here, don't worry about that. Ishmael even takes a bit of damage in the second fight due to her SP being low enough that her evades are no longer consistent. My third boss ended up being Papa Bongi. Between the head chickens constantly draining your SP and inflicting paralysis, I knew it wouldn't be safe to allow the boss itself to summon minions after the chickens died. I prioritized destroying the chicken bucket before killing the minions. I say that like it's an easy process, it's not. That being said, the boss has one of the most dangerous skills to deal with. 4 coins means 4 chances to have a failed evade, resulting in one of my units taking massive unnecessary damage. Not only does Gregor fail an evade against one of Bongi's weaker skills, but Dawn takes the full force of one of the 4 coin skills thanks to an evade, putting her on very low HP. Not only that, but by redirecting a lot of Bongi's attacks into Rogia to prevent the others from taking huge damage results in her taking a decent amount of damage in this fight as well. Ishmael also drops into negative sanity here, making her take just a small amount more damage. Even after all that, I was able to persist and finish off Papa Bungie before anyone succumbed to his onslaught of blunt attacks. I end up earning Thunder Branch, useless, from the fight here as well. I intentionally go away from the challenge fight on floor 4 to avoid being forced to fight the more obnoxious enemies in the game and... Wait, what's that music? I didn't even know that the middle could appear outside of challenge encounters. Nevertheless, their appearance terrified me. These enemies have a skill that can naturally outroll most of my evades without any boosts, one of the most terrifying counters in the entire game that I might be forced to deal with, and a passive ability that gives them plus coin boost. With Ishmael already being at very low sanity, I couldn't even rely on her massive roll power to offset the difference in enemy strength. She got so bad that I ended up intentionally panicking her to reset her HP to 0 in this fight, a decision that actually ended up paying off more than I thought because she got staggered on the same turn, so she wouldn't have been able to act anyways. I was getting really lucky with my clashes in this encounter, to the point where it seemed like the game was being a bit too nice to me. But right as I started to think that I'll get out of the fight relatively unscathed, tragedy strikes. I killed 2 enemies in the same turn, leaving the remaining little brothers with 2 plus coin boost, and Gregor's evade was just not strong enough to outroll one last punch, and he was killed. The first casualty occurring right at the beginning of floor 4. On the same turn, Don takes a similar hit and is left on only 10 hit points. It really hurts to lose our strongest attacker so soon after getting his upgrades, but there was no time to mourn. I took the next abnormality event knowing that it would probably force me to pick a bad option, and to my surprise, I actually ended up getting non-disclosure agreement as a result. This isn't too helpful since it's hard to prevent any of my sinners from taking damage, but a small damage boost is still appreciated. And this is where I have to talk about Base Yi Sang, because I actually had a 7th sinner I could use. Speaking plainly, this ID is garbage. Deflect rolls 11 at maximum, and his guard is very bad. The only reason I think he was worth taking into battle was for his passive and resistance to blunt damage, making him a good damage sponge while also boosting my own damage somewhat. The worst part is that the next fight is against robots, who can roll notoriously high with some of their skills. Not only that, but Sawblade bots do a ridiculous amount of damage if they manage to hit you, to the point that you'll see Rhodia lost half of her remaining HP in a single clash. I have to try to end this fight as quickly as I can to minimize the risk of Don being killed, and even though I took quite a lot of damage, I managed to keep anyone else from dying as well. But I wasn't out of the woods yet. In fact, I was going into the woods. The Fey Lantern check is one that I'm forced to pick unfavorably for since Midwinter's Nightmare is not a gloom gift. I wanted to avoid an unnecessary battle, but if I had avoided this next fight, Don would have been killed by the event damage. Fighting 6 Goulet at once usually isn't too difficult, but with Rhodia being weak to Gluttony and Don being a single hit from death no matter the attack, any focus encounter was a risk to my team. Encorp Heathcliff would have been really useful here if I had remembered to bring him. It took some time and a bit of luck, but fortunately, I was able to escape unscathed for now, with only Yi Sang taking a bit of damage. The next 2 fights were both a bit of a breather. Lobotomy ego enemies aren't too threatening, and neither are Thousand Strands Mermaid. Like I said, it only takes one unlucky evade. Having our second casualty just before the end boss meant we're down to only 5 units for the final fight. Let's talk about the end boss before we get there. I had been secretly hoping that we fought either KQH or Cromer here, as neither of them roll particularly high, so I can just evade their attacks for the most part. At the same time, encountering Shock Centipede or Drifting Fox would have basically constituted an instant loss, especially without Don in our team anymore. Our damage output is just not good enough to handle them. To add insult to injury, the game throws Blue Zippo Lighter at me in the last shop. Whatever I end up facing, it was going to be the final fight no matter what. The Bull is one of the most dangerous bosses in the entire game. It rolls incredibly high with all of its attacks, something my team can't reliably handle, as well as being incredibly bulky. What's worse is that my team can't even get the head to emerge for actually good damage potential. But nevertheless, I had to try. The fight started off good, with me dealing a decent amount of damage, but ultimately, we were only trading blows. Only Rhodia was able to reliably tank attacks, and only if she could discard her higher skills. And what's worse, since the bull lowers my SP with some attacks, my progress was only slowing down. I wasn't going to be able to beat this fight by keeping all 5 of my team members alive and in the party, but this was still going to be an uphill battle no matter what. I tried bringing only Rhodia and Ishmael to allow them to get more skills, but Ishmael wasn't able to contest any attacks and her SP fell too quickly. I tried to solo using Sinclair by relying on his evade, but he just couldn't overcome the bull's insane roll power. It just seemed like everything I tried wasn't enough to outdo the overwhelming power of the bull, and the fact that it was inflicting burn only provided more pressure to my team. There had to be something I could do, but I just wasn't able to get through. My team just wasn't strong enough. And then, as if on cue, the solution showed itself to me. Rhodia can completely tank all of the bull's attacks thanks to aggro plus her blunt resistance and insane amount of shield, and the bull deals SP damage with one of its attacks. By corroding into Rhyme Shank, I can inflict enough sinking to the bull to allow myself to deal enough damage to stagger it. But it isn't as easy as it sounds. Yisang's support passive was actually making her corrode too slowly, and the randomness of Rhodia's higher level skills actually made her sometimes take too much damage from burn before it could clear thanks to her passive. This meant that I had to bring Yisang into the fight. Eventually, I settled on bringing Rhodia, Ishmael, Sinclair, and Yisang, so that Rhodia and Ishmael both ended up with a second skill slot. Faust just didn't work because her aggro could draw attacks away from Rhodia, and so I didn't use her for the fight. It took a few tries, but eventually, I finally managed to corrode Rhodia and hit the bull with a double Rhyme Shank, nearly killing Sinclair in the process. I also was reminded that Rhyme Shank has a passive in this fight. Decreasing the bull's speed and attack power was really helpful and allowed Ishmael to outroll one of his skills to stagger him. And so, my struggle with the bull comes to a close, and so too does this Mono Gloom run end. I generated a grand total of 657 Gloom resources across the entire run. Hey, thanks for watching to the end of my video. Consider subscribing and liking the video, and I guess dislike if you disliked it. If you want to see me do another one of these videos, leave a comment saying which one you want me to do next. One thing to quickly bring up, I didn't mention the starting buffs that give you resources because it's up to you if you want to use them. If you're watching this video within the first few hours of it going up, I'm going to be streaming myself doing another one of these runs on my Twitch channel this afternoon, so come by if that's interesting to you. If you want to see the full run of this challenge, there's an unlisted video showing the entire thing minus the dungeon navigation in the description. I also want to give a shout out to my friend Scorp, who I convinced to do a Mono Gluttony run on his Twitch channel. He's one of the coolest people I know and does great content as well.
They're still never attacking though, they're like permanently panicked. Oh no, fuck, no! I'll be right back.
잘 썰렸다.